Page 586. Psalm 73. Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold. For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They are free from common human burdens. They are not plagued by human ills. Therefore, pride is their necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. From their callous hearts comes iniquity. Their evil imaginations have no limits. They scoff and speak with malice. With arrogance they threaten oppression. Their mouths lay claim to heaven, and their tongues take possession of the earth. Therefore, their people turn to them and drink up waters in abundance. They say, how would God know? Does the Most High know anything? This is what the wicked are like. Always free of care, they go on amassing wealth. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and have washed my hands in innocence. All day long I have been afflicted, and every morning brings new punishments. If I had spoken out like that, I would have betrayed your children. When I tried to understand all this, it troubled me deeply till I entered the sanctuary of God. Then I understood their final destiny. Surely you place them on slippery ground. You cast them down to ruin. How suddenly are they destroyed, completely swept away by terrors. They are like a dream when one awakes. When you arise, Lord, you will despise them as fantasies. When my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered, I was senseless and ignorant. I was a brute beast before you. Yet I am always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, and afterward you will take me into glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Those who are far from you will perish. You destroy all who are unfaithful to you. But as for me, it is good to be near God. I have made the sovereign Lord my refuge. I will tell of all of your deeds. Amen.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Colin. A couple of months ago, I was in a room with 100 other church leaders, roughly speaking, and the person who was leading the seminar then asked everyone to raise a hand who has never had a crisis of faith. Now, of 100 church leaders, how many would you expect to raise their hands? You think church leaders, they've got it all sorted, and they always have done. No one raised their hand at all. Every single of those 100 church leaders had at some point in their lives a crisis of faith of one kind or another. I'm not going to do that this morning. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you have never had a crisis of faith or if you have. But if that is anything to go by, then most of us, if not all of us, at some point in our lives, if we're Christians, will experience some sort of crisis of faith. Many will have doubts, many will have questions that they cannot resolve, struggles with God, questions of, is it all worth it or is it all true? Many will even have a patch in their life where they even renounce the faith, where they give up on their faith for a time. Sometimes we refer to that as backsliding. But Psalm 73 is a very raw and ancient song of faith that tackles one particular crisis of faith that we might have experienced or might still experience. And I've really been looking forward to preaching this psalm. It's actually one of my favorite psalms. And that's because Asaph's experience, the author of the song's experience, it was almost exactly as one crisis of faith that I had in my time, in years gone by. So as we go through the crisis of faith that Asaph goes through, I'm going to tell you my story as well. The situation that Asaph was going through was one when it seems better not to be a Christian. When it seems better not to be a Christian. He declares up front in the first verse what is true and correct. It almost sounds like he's very sure and very certain, and that's because he has been through the experience but now knows what is real and true. He says at the front that God is good and that he is good to his people. And so even though he has been through this on the verge of giving it up, he's able to declare what is true. But he had been on the verge of giving it all up completely. My experience was, as a 19-year-old student, I was living with 5 other friends, none of whom were Christians, down the road in Newport. And they were very much committed to getting whatever pleasure they could out of life at the time. So they were pursuing the classic lifestyle of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's all that they lived for, sex, drugs, rock and roll. And there was I, single and sober, and as I compared myself to them, I thought, what's the point? What's the point when they're enjoying everything so much, when they're getting so much pleasure out of life? And I felt myself being really downcast for a time, comparing myself to them. Now, I didn't actually do anything about it. It was only a very short period of time, just a matter of weeks, really. And I didn't give up on my faith. I didn't embrace the things that they were going for, except for the rock and roll, because there's nothing wrong with that, is there? It's not sinful to like rock and roll music and to enjoy making it. That in and of itself is not sinful. But I didn't do any of the other things that they were doing, the drugs and the sex, didn't pursue that. But I was having this internal crisis of faith. I was asking, is it really worth following Jesus? For Asaph, the details are slightly different. Rock and roll certainly didn't exist in those days. But he's looking at people who, as it tells us in verse 4, they don't seem to have any struggles in life. They don't seem to find anything hard. They're healthy, they're successful. In fact, the verses literally describe them as fat. That might make you sit up and think, why are they described as fat? Well, in those days, you couldn't be fat unless you were rich, because if you were poor, you didn't have enough food to live on. So as they're fat, they're rich, they're successful. Only rich people in this society could get into that sort of situation. In verse 9, it describes them as thinking of themselves almost as gods, as they lay claim on the heavens. Heaven is our place. We belong there. We're almost as gods ourselves. We rule heaven, and that means we can make a claim upon earth as well. The earth is ours as well, as they go on to say, in addition to claiming heaven as their own. And what's more, in verse 10, it shows people are actually listening to them. People are paying attention to them. People are drinking up these things that they're saying. They've gained a following. They're influencers in the world. And sandwiched in the middle is this explanation of how they get their wealth and success. So in verse 6, it talks about the violence that they carry out almost being like the clothes that they wear because they do it so much. And then in verse 8, it talks about them proudly threatening others, speaking malice, scoffing, arrogance, threatening others, oppressing others. That's the things that they do. It's not a pretty picture, but that's what they're like. And I'm sure we all know people like that, or at least we read in the newspapers about them, don't we? People who've succeeded in life and they're doing really well, but we know that there's stuff going on. We know that they haven't been entirely honest about the way that they've made their success, the way they've made their money, perhaps been a little bit shady, perhaps they've managed to avoid tax and things like that, perhaps they've always put other people down in order to get ahead, done dodgy deals, whatever it is. But even if we don't know if there are still people that we might look at who are rich and successful, who perhaps we don't know whether they have or haven't made dodgy things to get there, but there's certainly people who don't love God and worship him, and we think, well, why are they getting ahead where I'm not particularly rich and successful? How come they've got ahead when they're not Christians, and here am I pursuing a godly lifestyle but not doing particularly well in life? And how does that square up? Have you ever thought like that? I wonder if Asaph is perhaps thinking to himself, surely this isn't the way it's supposed to be. Surely if I'm someone who loves God and is faithful to him, surely I should be the one who's blessed. I should be the one who's rich and successful and healthy in my body and have no struggles in life. Whereas God should surely ignore those people who ignore you and even do things that are sinful. They should be stopped from being successful. They should be hindered from becoming rich and wealthy. Maybe we thought the same thing. But it leads then Asaph to say this in verse 13. Surely in vain I have kept myself pure, kept my heart pure, and I have washed my hands in innocence. He's saying surely once again. The first verse started with surely. Surely this is true of God. Here we've got surely again. Surely this is all pointless. Surely it's a waste of time, me being a Christian. Surely it's a waste of time, me trying to do the right thing and be holy. Surely it's a waste of time, me coming to church and praying and reading the Bible. Surely it's been pointless because it hasn't made me rich and successful or pursue enjoyment in life or whatever else it might be. Have we ever come to that conclusion? What do we do if we come to that conclusion? What do we do if we think similarly? Even if we haven't said it out loud, what do we do? Well, I think Asaph goes through three things, and they are helpful to us here. So first of all, we need to remain with God and his people. You see, trying to deal with our doubts in complete isolation, with no help from anyone else, and with no contact with anyone else, is not a healthy position to be in. That doesn't mean you have to publicly declare that you're renouncing your faith as soon as you have doubts, because that is not helpful either. And Asaph goes on to talk about that in verse 15. He says that speaking out like that, publicly declaring it, perhaps standing from the front as a worship leader, as Asaph most probably would have been, for him to have done that publicly, declaring he was struggling in his faith in this particular way, would have betrayed God's people, would have caused some of them to stumble. But he did remain with God's people. There's a real turning point of the psalm that is the first line of verse 17. So have a look at verses 16 and 17, just to give the context. When I tried to understand all of this, the rich doing well, the ungodly doing well in life, when I tried to understand all this, it troubled me deeply. There's the crisis of faith. Till I entered the sanctuary of God. What changes everything is that he came into God's presence, where God's people were worshipping. The sanctuary is the holy space, the place where God's people meet to worship him. And here he is entering that place of God, and it changes everything. We might feel like frauds coming to church when we're having a crisis of faith. If we're really questioning, is this true? then we might think I'm a fraud to keep coming to church. We might think it's useless reading the Bible on my own at home and carrying on praying when I've got these doubts in my mind. I remember going to church when I was going through this crisis of faith and feeling utterly ridiculous, stupid, worthless. All these feelings going on inside of what on earth am I doing here? But actually it's often through these means of grace that God works to resolve our uncertainties. It may be that sharing our doubts with a close, trusted believer, fellow believer, who we know is mature and can handle our doubts, if we can share with someone, that might be very helpful. I'd gladly listen to any one of you who is going through a time of crisis of faith and wants to share their doubts and their questions. It might be that through reading the Bible, God speaks to us. It might be through prayer that suddenly we're awakened to the reality of our faith once again. So if we give up on those things, if we give up on being in church and reading and praying and communing with God and with his people, if we give up on that, we're missing out on an opportunity for our doubts to be reconciled in Jesus. For my own experience, as I was going through this time of crisis of faith, of doubting it and feeling like it wasn't worth it, I hadn't given up on reading the Bible. And I happened to be reading the Psalms. And I happened to come to Psalm 73. Happened in God's providence. And it just happened to speak exactly into my situation in this wonderfully powerful way that helped me back into a position of faith. So if doubts are going to be a normal part of our experience as Christians, which the evidence shows they will be, we will all probably experience times of doubt and crises of faith. If that's going to be our experience, then when that comes, make sure you remain with God and his people. Don't do it in isolation. Share with trusted brothers and sisters in Christ. Keep coming to the church fellowship. Keep reading your Bible, praying. And maybe God might use one of those means to speak to you and to help you overcome that crisis of faith if and when you experience that. Secondly, we need to remember the destiny of the godless. Now imagine watching someone who's having the nicest meal that they could possibly enjoy. 7-course meal, whatever it might be. You insert whatever food is your favorite, but maybe some baked camembert as a starter, and then a nice T-bone steak for the main course with the best sauce you could imagine drizzled across it, nicely cut chips. Sorry if I'm making you hungry. And perhaps a lovely chocolate fudge sundae dessert. I'm giving away what my preferences are here, aren't I? A lovely drink to enjoy. Imagine watching someone who's enjoying this finest meal you could possibly imagine. And you might look at them and think, wow, that's amazing. I wish I had that food. I wish I was sat in their seat enjoying that meal. Until you realize this is their last meal on death row as they're about to be executed. Are you quite so envious of them when you realize that meal is their last meal before being executed? Do you really want to sit in that chair in their place and enjoy that meal if it means you're about to be executed as well? Well, of course not. But that's the kind of change that happens in Asaph's mind. He might look at the meal, he might look at them being rich and successful in life and think, I wish I had that. But then he looks at their destiny and realizes, actually, I don't want to be in their seat. I don't want to be in their shoes. So the last line of verse 17 is where he really begins to convey this. So he's gone into the sanctuary of God, and that helps him understand the final destiny of people who are without God. And then he develops that on into verse 18. Notice here there's another surely. Surely this is true. This is what he knows to be certain. Though he thinks it's almost certain that he's kept his heart pure in vain, this is what he now knows to be definitely true. Surely true. Surely, verse 18, you place them on slippery ground. You cast them down to ruin. How suddenly are they destroyed, completely swept away by terrors. They're like a dream when one awakes. When you arise, Lord, you will despise them as fantasies. So these unbelievers who Asaph thinks, well, they're doing really well in life, even though they're sinners, they will actually face God's judgment, is what he comes to realize to be true, or remind himself of to be true. And it's because they pursued their wealth and their success instead of pursuing the living, true God. Because they have elevated themselves up to be gods rather than bowing before the one ruler of the universe, the true living God. Because they haven't bowed to him, because they haven't acknowledged him, because they've lived for these sinful pleasures instead. Because of all of that, they will face God's destruction. They will be, as it says, cast down to ruin. So all that they've done in this life, all that they've amassed, all that they've gained, the wealth, the success, all of it will come to nothing. I'm sure we've all had dreams that have seemed so intense and real. I had one just the other night. I dreamt that the waters had risen very suddenly across the whole world, and all of a sudden my house was surrounded by water. We were a coastland house overnight, which was wonderful, and we saw dolphins jumping in the waves outside my house, just a few meters away. Wonderful dream. It was so real when I was dreaming it. But then I woke up. It was over. I could open the curtains and look out on the garden, and there was no water there. It was just hedges and trees and things. No dolphins in my garden that morning when I woke up. And what seems so real in the dream just suddenly disappears, doesn't it, when you wake up? And that's the kind of language, the poetic language that Asaph is using here of these people. They're in a dream. They're living the dream, you could say. As they're successful and as they're wealthy, they're living the dream. They're what every human wants. Except it is a dream. Because suddenly they're going to wake up in the reality of God's presence. They're going to experience his justice, his righteousness. And they will be found lacking. They will experience his punitive judgment. They will get what they deserve for their sin, for cutting God out of their lives. All of their success is a mere fantasy. And that fantasy will be a nightmare when they face God's justice. That's the kind of language Asaph talks about here. Now that's putting it negatively, which is important, but we also must put it positively. And at the end of the psalm, that's what Asaph does. So thirdly, we need to refocus on all we have in Jesus. Refocus on what you have in Jesus. Now that's not just what is to come. We're talking about the destiny of the godless and how in the future they will face God's judgment. And when we're talking about positively what we have in Jesus if we follow him, we're not just talking about future. We're not just talking about, as it's been called, pie in the sky when we die. Because there's a lot for us to experience in this lifetime of the goodness that we have in Jesus. So cast your eyes at verses 23 and 24. Yet I am always with you, Asaph says to God. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterwards you will take me into glory. So those first 3 lines that we read out there, they are all part of our experience in the here and now, in this lifetime. Because it's afterwards he will take me into his glory. We're going to come on to that. But our experience now is that we have so much from God's good hand in Jesus now. You have so much to live for in Jesus now, if you're a Christian. In Jesus, we are always with God. We have God's Spirit living within us. And so we have this imminent, immediate connection with God the Father. And that's because of Jesus giving his life to make us one with God as Father, Son, and Spirit. We're not only with him, but we're held by him. We don't just have his presence, but we have his grip. Now, as you think of being held by the right hand, you might think of a child holding on to their parent's hand. It's a very appropriate image if that's what you're conjuring up. You see, a child might be held by the hand of a parent as they're walking through a busy shopping centre or crossing a busy road. And the child might sometimes hold on with a tight grip. If a child sees a car or hears a roaring motorbike, they might grab onto the parent's hand a little bit tighter. But if they see a shop that has toys, they might release the grip and want to go and pull off in the direction of the shop or the toys. But what does the parent do? The parent knows this is dangerous, that if the child's grip is loosened, then the child could be running off across a road, hit by a car, or lost in a busy shopping centre. And so even though the child holds tight but then lets go and holds tight but lets go, the parent has a firm grip, holding the child's hand so the child cannot escape. And Christians, that is our experience through life. Our grip loosens and tightens as we're gripped by this or by that, but the Father holds on to us with a tight grip, keeping us holding fast. And what's more, he guides us. He helps us to go the right ways throughout our lives. As he holds us by our hands, he guides us the right way to go through our lives. Now, those are just three of the wonderful things that we have in Jesus in this lifetime. If you search the Bible, you will find countless more wonderful things that we have in Jesus in our lives. But it's not just for this lifetime. It's also for beyond as well. So as the second half of verse 24 goes on to talk about as well, there is so much more to come. So though the destiny of the ungodly is judgment, the destiny of the believer is glory. Verse 24, you guide me with your counsel, and afterwards you will take me into glory. And then as verse 26 poetically puts it, though our bodies, our physical bodies, flesh and heart will fail, even though that's the case, we have God who is the strength of our hearts. He keeps us strong in himself forever. And he is our portion. He is our share. He is what we delight in and participate in forever. So for us who have faith in God now and who follow him now, even if we have little in this life, no success, no wealth, whatever it is compared to those who are ungodly but rich and successful, even if we have little, we have so much more in eternity. We have so much more in eternity than even the richest on this earth could have now. We have so much more because we have him. And that's why we've got verse 25. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. Even if going to the new heavens and the new earth made you richer than the guy who owns Amazon, who's probably the richest man on the earth, it changes all the time, but even if going to heaven meant you could have all of his wealth, it would be nothing because you have Jesus and you have him for eternity. There's nothing we desire on earth that is greater than having God himself. It reminds me of that song that we sometimes sing by Robin Mark. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. There's nothing compared to knowing God, Father, Son, and Spirit. Nothing better, nothing more desirable. And we have him now, and we have him for eternity. Asaph sums it up pretty well in the last two verses. Have a look at those, 27 and 28. Those who are far from you will perish. You destroy all who are unfaithful to you. But as for me, it is good to be near God. I have made the sovereign Lord my refuge. I will tell of all your deeds. So look, doubts are normal for believers. If you go through a time of crisis of faith, of doubt, of asking, is it worth it? Don't think that you're the freak. That's part of all of our experience at times. Let's be honest about that. We will face the temptation to pack it in at times. We will probably look at people who are doing well in this life and think, well, is it really worth being a Christian if I have to forego all of that? But let's make sure we bed this down deep within us. I don't expect you to remember the headings. I don't expect you to remember any of the specific points necessarily, but put what we've talked about down deep so that when you come to a period of crisis of faith, if that happens in your life, make sure you can draw upon these truths. Let's learn them so that we can be helped ourselves in a time of crisis, but let's also learn them so that when a brother or a sister in church goes through a similar crisis of faith, we can help them as well. We can encourage a brother or sister to keep on going when they're going through a time of struggle. And that's because knowing Jesus is better than anything else we could ever have otherwise.